Good afternoon. I am Richard Ackley, a tribal elder presently living in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I'm meeting a requirement on the New Testament for Bexley Seabury Seminary in Chicago. I'm part of a cohort where we will be receiving a Master's of Divinity based upon our portfolio of experiences. This result of the discussion of the book of Hebrews was really a discussion that I've had with Tim Webster relating to how I see it from an indigenous portal. But before I do that, I want to do just a little, I would call it a introduction from artificial intelligence. So many of us use computers. But indigenous cultures, the book of Hebrews, and the authority, a complex interaction. This is what AI says, and who knows where they swept it up. And I have an agreement with it to some degree. Interpreting the book of Hebrews through an indigenous lens are the following constructs. Cultural context. Indigenous cultures possess rich and diverse worldviews, spiritual traditions, and understandings of authority and leadership, which differs significantly from the Greco-Roman context which the book of Hebrews was written. 2, in indigenous communities encounter Christianity engage with texts like Hebrews, there's a potential for a religious possible blending. It may not. Traditional beliefs and practice blend with Christian teachings. It could blend. Decolonizing theology. Some scholars advocate for decolonizing biblical interpretation, acknowledging the historic and ongoing impact of colonialism on indigenous communities and re-examining biblical narratives through indigenous perspectives. I will conclude with the authority in indigenous cultures in the book of Hebrews. I did mention I've grown up in the Ojibwe culture. I've grown up in a small community in northern Wisconsin along Lake Superior. In my previous videos, I did mention I lived in a community. I live near a border town, and my whole life has been based upon an indigenous context. But to repeat again, authority indigenous cultures versus the book of Hebrews, elders and ancestors. I am sitting here today as a product of a genetic hunting, fishing, and gathering society, and I'm honored to be able to do this because it was through the efforts of a group of family members who allowed me to remain positive. That's probably why the message of the Jesus way is important for me. But elders and ancestors, many indigenous cultures place great emphasis on the authority of elders and ancestors who serve as custodians of tradition, wisdom, and spiritual guidance. I'll add one other sidebar. I believe I'm not authorized to interfere in people's lives, but I can meet them with dignity, as I often say, with respect, in a responsible way, and in a reciprocity way. That could be a social covenant. The other one is emphasis on community and consensus. The tribe I'm from, it fits this. Indigenous leadership often prioritizes community consensus and collective decision-making over hierarchical structures. Historically, I've had difficulty in my 79 years, almost I'll be 80, with denominational authority, not with biblical authority. Potential conflicts with biblical authority, the emphasis on Jesus' ultimate authority, and the unique role of the priesthood in Hebrews might conflict with indigenous understanding of spiritual leadership and communal authority. With that format, I'd like to proceed with some comments and questions that Mr. Webster has prepared for me today.
All right. Yes, thank you, Richard. So that's an interesting introduction, and it actually fits very nicely with what I was thinking might be an interesting approach to talking about the book of Hebrews, not as sort of pitting one institution or tradition, namely Judaism, against a Christian institution. I mean, perhaps that would be an interesting discussion too, but I'm more interested in what the indigenous perspective, ways in which the indigenous perspective is similar to the perspective of the author of Hebrews, not as representing a Christian institution, but as an elder who's looking at the Jewish traditions and institutions as a Jesus follower, as someone who is sort of deconstructing or critiquing the ways in which the Jewish system is incomplete or unhelpful, or the ways in which has been turned into something that's unhelpful. And in that way, I think it's pretty interesting. So yeah, maybe that would be.
Yeah, if I can interrupt, I believe the word is translations. Like 40 years ago, I have the Hebrew analysis from the Collegeville series. I have the format from the 40 years ago. I purchased these when they were only $2.25. What is the Bible? And then in the Episcopal tradition, we have the New Revised Standard Version. And then since our discussion we have had the First Nations version, and undergraduate school contemporary Western religion heritage, we had there were different models of the translations. The reason why I say translations is, as an elder and as a tribal member of the Ojibwe tribe, I enter this in a manner that I'm respectful of the historic context of the Book of Hebrews and what has taken place, literary, archaeologically, translation, whether it be whatever languages, Greek, Roman, but I have to enter it from a culture that requires me to deal with life in a consensus way, and in a way that elders are present, but elders did not come out of the womb knowing this. We were guided by other elders. So that 7th generation or 8 generations is so important to me. But the reason why I mention that is I have a sensitivity to the Christian theology, but what happens is, as we speak, one of my mentors is in Florida, and there's 2 other mentors that I have. One is an Anglican seminary professor, the other one is an Episcopal priest. All 3 are Episcopal priests. Sometimes the ecumenical movement forgets that native traditions and native symbols and native dynamics are important. So as I previously said with AI, it's just allowing me to make that presentation without, I would say, a hybrid or a model of the 2, but it's the way I enter. And I can't really change the authoritarian model, but I understand what has happened to the message that Jesus Christ tried to provide to that group in Hebrews. Maybe it's good that it was before talking about the end of the 66 books of the Bible, as we move to the New Testament, with the possibility of, if you think of Revelation or things, but it says, what's the message with Hebrews? And for me, thinking about this is the dialogue has to be one of reconciliation, but if the dialogue is based upon authority and oppression, it doesn't create good dialogue. So for me, entering this is why it's so important to me to enter the Hebrew with the consensus, because over 2,000 years, I don't know if I can cite this, but there were women involved in Christianity, 3rd, 4th century, and then, the tradition I'm part of, I'm not getting off. We had a brief discussion about, it's not so much the constructs of biblical tradition or scripture, it's the context of what happens in the year 2025. Now, it's interesting, it took an act of Congress, they may negate this under the current administration, that the American Indian Religious and Freedom Act, we have now have native religions on the same par as Christianity, but we didn't really worry about when the Reformation and other things that took place. The Episcopalians came out of that, and I keep restating that. You've heard me say this many times. The authority model with the Episcopalians, I would not be an Episcopalian if they weren't an inclusive faith. That doesn't mean there isn't denominational, and I respect authority, but in that context, in that history, the understanding of the message of Jesus was not a problem to me, and paralleling that, the phase of, I use a term called mutual ministry. A priest can't do everything, a lay person can't do everything. They do things together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, maybe, yeah, that's an interesting, so perhaps an interesting starting point for a question would be, the First Nations version, as you mentioned, is one of your sources there. Attempts to decolonize the New Testament to some degree, and of course Hebrews is part of that. And so maybe that's starting to move that direction. But
if I can interrupt, the Hebrew under the translations from the First Nations Indigenous, I'm real careful because there's over 400 tribes in this country, and when we first started talking a couple of years ago, I mentioned the translation of The Messenger by Peterson. One of the difficulties is there is not a specific construct for the Ojibwe experience, which there is, and we almost have to do this in a manner that reflects the unique values of the tribe you're part of. Like, my spouse is Oneida, I live amongst the Oneidas. They're a farming dynamic. I come from a hunting, fishing, and gathering society. It's important for me to care for family. It's important for me to care for my health, and it's important for me to deal with creation and live in my own environment. That doesn't say I don't necessarily negate the larger construct, but we call it, I'm very careful not to use the word pan-Indian, because when the missionaries came, they never allowed for this conversation. Now, again, I've shared books with you about Vine Deloria, God is Red, and other things. It's not so much God is Red as the lenses you see through this. And I mentioned Bishop Steve Charleson talks about the 4 directions in the gospel and all that. So all we're saying in my mind is, if I came from a Southwestern or another tribe, paralleling that, some of the European groups, and you've heard me say this before, the Scandinavian groups seem to be comfortable with the Ojibwe paradigm, our Cree, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a translation. Now, I would hopefully, as scholars become more aware, they parallel the Ojibwe experience. That's very much of an action. We would call it almost like apostolic action. Mm-hmm. Like we would be
very a language, for example, that's very focused on verbs.
Well, I wonder if we ever heard of the Acts of Apostles. The Acts of the Apostles require us to share our gifts, and we're not negating the importance of an agrarian society. We're just saying we're constantly in our cultural paradigm. I grew up that way. I grew up being a caretaker, but not a manipulative caretaker.
Yeah, and I think the editor of the chief translator of First Nations version would agree with you because he acknowledges that the First Nations version is a pan-Indian effort with editors from different nations, and he acknowledges that can only take you so far. So for the Ojibwe experience, you have to go further than a pan-Indian. Though there is some similarities among the tribes that he's trying to pick up on. Yeah, but that only gets you so far.
Yeah, and the similarities would be, whether it be the Christian construct, whether it be any religious construct, you're trying to provide for a reasonable understanding of your spirituality, or Jesus Christ, the Creator, or the Spirit. And 2, you're trying to provide for an understanding of the community you're part of. But then what came across, I'm not getting off on on destruction of the residential schools, getting off on all these other oppressions, because what happens in that circle of life if you've been given the gift of healthiness, the gift of respect, the gift of responsibility and reciprocity? What happens if you have this caring dynamic that doesn't have to be evaluated by either it's a spiritual, cultural gift without manipulation? Now, people go to college for 9 or 10 years. This morning I spoke to a woman who was a administrator in a psychiatric ward, and she was coping with some own change of life issues. But she was really not religiously community oriented. The nice thing about tribalism, and I use a term called retribalization, in some ways I believe it fits the book of Hebrews, because we recognize the Creator, we recognize the emphasis of the Jesus way or the ministry, and we recognize the responsibilities I have in that model of caring. But then what happens is, if there isn't any mutual understanding and respect, you just destroy the worth of what Native people are about. We had another sidebar conversation. It may fit the book of Hebrews, what I shared with you, what Black Elk Speaks. He became knowledgeable about his worldview, but then in this 2025, someone who read his paper is now an expert on Black Elk Speaks, and maybe he should be a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. That's a denominational result. What we're not saying is he or she did not ask for that type of recognition. That was a response. And in some ways, did the book of Hebrews really, if it's that type of, did it really, is it necessary to have the covenant? In that time, I would imagine in some authoritative model, because that's what that cultural group needed or expected or understood. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but I don't have that. And then but then when you deal with denominational Christianity, then it comes in and you want to destroy or eliminate the native, we call it indigenous or Ojibwe ethos. You're denying the full impact of that human being to accept the Jesus way.
Yeah, well, let me pick up on that then with a question, because it seems to me that, and this has to do with respect. It seems to me that certainly Jesus embodied this when some people look at Jesus as the first deconstructionist. I mean, he explicitly would teach, "You have heard it said, but I say," and he had plenty of critique for the religious leaders of his day. However, he had a great deal of respect for the basis of their beliefs, namely the Torah, the scriptures, and so he talked about fulfilling the scriptures rather than getting rid of all their traditions and just destroying all their traditions. And it seems to me that in the book of Hebrews you have something similar going on, and I'd like you to comment on this, and that is, like, for example, where clearly, like for example in chapter 7, when he's talking about Melchizedek and the priestly order, in some sense he wants to critique the traditions, the Jewish religious, the hierarchy of priests. He wants to critique that hierarchy of priests and say the Jesus way is superior, or, well, that would be an English translation, but the Jesus way is something that's an alternative to this hierarchy. But he also, in saying that, he's saying he doesn't want to disrespect their own traditions, their own religion, and so he's not saying that the priestly order is a bad thing, and so that to me is an interesting way. How you can address these cultural issues, like like the Jewish idea of national superiority, but still be respectful of the fundamental traditions.
Yeah, and there's a construct or a context that I share in that. One of my good friends told me this. He says, I've met seminarians and professors who say the Torah, we know all the over 600 traditions. He says, you Ojibways probably have 1,200. You have a rule for everything. You have a process and an understanding, diplomacy. And what happens is ours is based upon consensus and love and caring, not based upon authority and oppression. And I believe what happens is if the scholar, the biblical scholar, would give some time to understand the indigenous roots of protocol and our indigenous foundations, we parallel. As Bishop Steve Charleson says, we're viewing a Native person as like an Old Testament theology trying to recover or understand the New Testament model. The reason why that's important is I would not be an active member of the Episcopal Church if it wasn't an inclusive, male, female, part of it. But that doesn't mean that the denominational authority, and I chuckle whenever these people do the ordination process, do you submit to the obedience of the bishop? We used to say, do we submit to the obedience of Jesus Christ? Do we submit to the obedience of us as a religious community? That social construct or that social covenant ought to be clarified. And when you negate an indigenous paradigm and you only assimilate the Judeo-Christian and you don't include us, then that makes it difficult for tribal people to enter into a religious experience, either ordained or mutual or whatever it is. So I guess I would have to answer that or respond that it's a matter of history, but my thesis would be, I suppose I could spend a couple of years doing this, if you ever deal with Ojibways, you notice how careful I am when I meet you. I always acknowledge your ancestors. I always acknowledge this. But what happens is people want to negate that sermon or that message of indigenous portal. I just think we do a disservice to many people around the world. Now, in fairness, many tribal people, whether it be Asia, Africa, have decided that the Judeo-Christian, because it's the Great Commission again, I mean, it's a little different here, but they forget, whoever they are, that they come out of a culture that you cannot erase. I mean, you cannot erase hundreds of years of generations. Remember I said when we were coming over to set this interview up, I was reading something where the former, bless his soul, the former Pope Francis says, when a priest was in the Amazon, he lightened up a little on the duties. So I was a good friend of mine who passed away, a Franciscan priest, Father Mike. I thought the world of him. I said, Father Mike, how'd you survive in the Amazon? He said, Richard, I got into their cultural element, because when you're in the jungle and in that Amazon, you don't have to have Anglo-Catholic, you don't have to have the robes. He said he just brought the bread and wine or the elements to the community. And that's really a difficult acceptance. It's almost like a purity of thought in the sense of acceptance. But I found it interesting that Pope Francis, and this Father Mike was a Franciscan, but he was a Jesus believer, but that's not to say everyone is having that. Is it the Amazon jungle, or could it be in the suburbs? The same lack of understanding of bringing people together could be almost like finding a neutrality of religious belief systems. Like the person who will view this is in Florida at an ecumenical relationship, and it's hard for people who are trapped in whatever ecumenical relations are. There's indigenous relations too, but for us, ceremony would be like the Torah, very careful and very respectful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's something, to use the language of Hebrews, there's something about the order of Melchizedek, or the priesthood of Jesus, the Jesus way, that that doesn't negate or erase the priestly order of the Hebrews, of Aaron, or similarly doesn't negate the the cultural order of the Ojibwe people.
Yeah, in parallel to that, I have a bishop, and I respect him really. He applied for a job in a diocese in, I think, in 1980, 1979. He said he didn't believe in the ordination of women because there was a biblical contract. But then the Philadelphia 12, the one they were ordained. Today, in the Episcopal tradition, we have the ordination of women. So it's the idea that the deconstruction of that allowed, for women to be ordained. And what does that have to do with it? It has to do with the fact that authority may change over the years, and the two in the Hebrews, if the Jesus way and the order, and I never pronounce this word correctly, how do you pronounce the order of the?
Oh, Melchizedek.
Melchizedek, it reminds me of a comic strip deal, but it's the idea that if there could have been a way to incorporate that, but then through the whole journey of the temple and the distrust and all that, we're still suffering from 2,000 years of who do we trust, who do we understand. If there could have been some better understanding of that, we wouldn't have as much conflict between many of the denominationals around the world that's why I say indigenous Judeo-Christian. So to answer you carefully, I would say that dynamic provides for the responsibilities I have as being part of God's people are the Jesus way, if you want to call it that in that context. And I believe we present something in faith by allowing us to enter that portal with our indigenous part. We're as strong and as disciplined because we come from a disciplined world, and we don't have a conflict with the Jesus way. It's just sometimes people don't want to put it on the same construct, same parallel.
Right. Well, this is the interesting thing, and there's one way of looking at the Jesus way as not just another competing religion, but the way of Creator that brings all of them together. And that's an interesting idea to
Well, let me interrupt again. I don't know how else I can live. If I negate my tribalism, I become assimilated and blah. If I negate Judeo, then I become evangelical, and I don't want to do what the Mormons do in this artificial. They got out of it by saying we're the lost tribe, the Levites. Be careful how I say this. We just live in a history, in a dynamic that my faith, and I have no problem with understanding the Creator, or no problem with understanding that, but in the sense of the expression of creation in the Hebrews, to me, as I said, it was probably important for them to have this as an understanding, like being on the ground, because the revelation, what may happen in the future is different than what's happening right now. 2025, there's some serious issues around the world.
Yeah. Well, are there other? We've talked a little bit about. This whole thing about Melchizedek is very interesting because I don't think the author of Hebrews is actually trying to ground the argument in a theological tradition necessarily. Melchizedek is almost sort of an analogy because there's just not much written about him, so he doesn't have lineage, and he's not part of the Aaron's priesthood, and so he can use him as an analogy.
Let me share this on the Hebrews in 5. Every high priest chosen from among mortals to put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He's able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. And because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins, as well as those of the people. And one does not presume to take dishonor, but takes it only when called by God, such as Aaron was. So also Christ had not glorified himself becoming a high priest, but was appointed by one who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." He says in another place, "You are my priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Help me out here, Melchizedek. Okay. All I'm saying about that, the number 5, is it's the idea that there was a message, but the message, according even to annotated stuff, the discipline for if there's a spiritual immaturity, but what I don't like about the construct here is when we enter the portal as indigenous persons, we come in with our balance, we come in with our competencies, we come in with our skills, we come in with our order, and if that's not accepted, then we acquire the 9 steps of, let's say, ordination process in the Episcopal Church. Now, I'm 80, I will be 80 in a couple of months. Does that man still have a right to be ordained, whatever that means? I would say yes, but then our culture, who I'm part of, they like to shelve elders. They like to say, the bishop, you can't do this. But if you're ordained as a human, if you're ordained in the Jesus way, you're ordained forever. But in a functional capacity, who is to say that person could not still be a messenger, carry the views? And indigenous people, in fact, the number of times you and I have interacted with with the younger college students, and they seem to enjoy the elderhood without all the trappings of ceremony.
Without hoops and certifications and all this sort of stuff to, it's enough for a Native University to simply recognize that you're an elder in residence. There's no institutional vetting that needs to happen to determine that, and the Native students are fine with that.
Yeah, and notice I started off with AI as my best companion, because the human being, if as my one bishop would say, if you're ignorant of being ignorant, you're still ignorant. So to bring knowledge together, all I'm saying is the Hebrew model and is. I understand that dynamic, but I come from a culture that leadership is consensus. I come from a culture that requires harmony and negotiation, arbitration, not domination. And that's a little different than the colonial model that came about. I mean, I have no problem with remember I said we started, it's what take place in the history of the biblical experience. But for me, in the New Testament, it's bringing that in, and that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, well, in a sense, you're kind of talking about a similar kind of leadership as that passage you just quoted in Hebrews 5, because Jesus, Creator sets free in the language of the First Nations version, can be the kind of leader that can be respected. And because as the Creator, He's knowledgeable about the needs of all different peoples. And like in verse 2, he says, He can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since He Himself is beset with weakness. That is, Jesus can relate to the needs of all the different peoples as Creator, and so he can have that sort of leadership or eldership status without having, in a way that's more natural for, say, a Chippewa person.
Yeah, our Ojibwe, Chippewa, Anishinaabe. But what's interesting is I look at the indigenous translation, and I can't believe we're actually saying the same thing here, how a chief holy man is chosen to be a holy man, and we look at, the idea is the understanding of where it comes out of, and I didn't. Okay. Okay. In other words, it's such a short message, but the message as a sermon or as a narrative or as a letter, you are trying to find a way to have people take an interest in a religious experience. And the last one would be this is actually okay. In the translation of the indigenous one, it says here. This is the final word. So now, my relatives, I counsel you to take to heart this short message. I've written it to lift up you and give you your strength. I want you to know that our spiritual brother, he gives honor. Timothy has been set free from prison. He comes soon. He will travel together to sea. Greet all spiritual leaders and all Creator's holy ones. I send you greetings from the land of, may the gifts of Creator be kindness to you all. In other words, the understanding of kindness, the understanding of caring, and why do people believe in a religious experience? In harmony and respect, not manipulation, not exploitation, not domination, not abuse, on and on and on. And when you have people who have made use of the Christian doctrine and religion, I won't get off on false prophets and blah, blah, blah. And even the Great Commission going out, I was always uncomfortable at that on this rock going, because the ones that went out never allowed for this interpretation. So I think the pushback in the book of Hebrews was how to balance this out as the Jesus way was incorporated in that. But it was sensed in authority and transmission. Mine was survival and how do you live in a society where you have to just care for people. Today, with millions of people, this conversation we're having here is probably not the conversation you would hear in a traditional Sunday Bible study.
Yeah.
Whatever those words mean. I mean, that's all I'm trying to say.
Well, I'm not sure if this, we haven't talked about this before, so we can drop this if it's not.
No, I like to be more inclusive, because you've known me long enough, I can respond to something, anything. Yeah. Please proceed.
Yeah. No, I mean with like a new topic. I'm not sure if this new topic will be interesting, but let's hear it. I'll try it out and see what you think. Because one of the things that is interesting is he also, of course, sacrifice. So this is mostly like in chapter 13. Sacrifice is extremely important to the Jewish people in their religious system, because they have all these sacrifices, sort of an acknowledgement of their humanity, of their weakness, their propensity for evil, and their need to kind of make things right. And they have this whole sacrificial system. And some people would say that the sacrificial system also has to do with sublimating evil desires. That is, if I sacrifice, maybe this is more of a Christian interpretation. But if I sacrifice, for example, my own needs and put somebody else first, then I'm not just always acting selfishly and oppressing them, for example. But I just wonder, I mean, so the author of Hebrews is trying to, make this argument that the sacrifice of Jesus is somehow sufficient and covers, the old system of sacrifices that the Jewish people were using. And I wonder, I mean, I don't know if we've talked about this, but I wonder if you have some thoughts on how this idea of sacrifice or putting the needs of others first, what insights you have from your own culture.
I would say the definition of sacrifice is perhaps the definition of, I'm careful because you don't want to become a codependent, enabling, or a manipulator. What you're doing is as an elder, as a person in a family in a tribal system, you're constantly re-tribalizing yourself. You're readjusting to the needs. If somebody is hurt, you help them. If somebody needs a sharing of your wild rice or fish, you help them. But you don't want to create a dependency. And what I believe happens to the religious world is they get caught up in ceremony, not so much in ceremony is okay, but not so much in the spiritual aspect. And one has to be careful because you can't do everything for everyone. Remember, I've shared with you that I'm from a culture where I cannot interfere in someone's life because it'd be kind of like, it's not me living that life you're living. I can offer a strategy, but I had a conversation this morning with a person, and in that conversation, the conversation took a certain direction that I didn't think it was doing like an intake. So this woman, we're talking about her life and her change from working at a mental health institution. I says, remember, you're your own person and you got to set your own direction. So she emotionally flooded on me. By that, she just got to get tears. So I said, you could cap that, because we can save the tears for another time, but we're trying to deal with some transitions. So then we got that phase done. Then she emotionally flooded again. I said, could you cap that? Because we agreed upon, we'll talk again. So in our Western model, everybody takes time, if there was a video camera seeing what I do, it would be appropriate, because I didn't want her to lose herself and what bubbled up. I wanted to be respectful. What does it have to do with anything? It has to do with the understanding that if you have a sacrifice or if you have a gift, you try not to make it repetitive. You try not to make it to the point it becomes just like rote memory, or it becomes mechanical. Like in the context of the part I am, you're a Christian in a traditional way, whether it's, not traditional in the sense of native tradition or Christian tradition. It's almost like you're going through the manner, you're going through the play. Actors can do a better job in ministry than priests, bishops, and other folks. You're trying to make this real, that a human being is so important. Their life is so important. Their community is so important. But in some ways here, the sacrifice, and this may be a small thing, but in the cultures they take it. You offer tobacco, you offer cedar, you offer sage for a good harvest. You offer things. It could be over dramatized, but when you're out there trying to get some food, or think of farmers in this day and age with climate change, they have to depend upon the weather, otherwise their whole harvest is gone. I'm from a culture where if the winds came off Lake Superior and a big storm would come, the rain would just destroy the rice crop. So we would have to wait for another year to get a reasonable rice crop. So sacrifice with intent, not sacrifice as a ceremony. So.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think, and I don't know always how to map this, but I'd like to think that the point of ceremony is not ceremony. The point of ceremony is to keep reorienting and reminding us of some deeper realities that are very important, and the ceremony just helps us to remember those things and incorporate them into our lives.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring this a little awkwardness, and I'm surprised I'm even going to say this. In 2025, May 5th, there's a big emphasis on tariffs. I believe the spirituality or religious dominations are like a tariff. We're putting too much emphasis on certain dynamics and not putting emphasis upon what I call mutual ministry, what I call community enhancement. We're always caught up in this denominational force, this who's doing this, who's doing that, and I never thought of it that way, but we need to be more respectful of the traditions people come out of, and that's all I'm saying. But then if somebody says to me, the Ojibways are part of the lost tribe of Levites, then I get awkward. If the Reformation model says I should give up my indigenous culture and you call me a savage, like if you understand the language of savage, if Black Elk Speech says the guy should be a saint, maybe he was comfortable just being who he was. Maybe he was just comfortable in that time and space. But what happens to larger constructs of religion, you constantly have to make modifications. I was surprised that I was, as I was preparing myself for this video, I was surprised that Pope Francis adjusted in the Amazon. And now another thing, there's an Episcopal priest that decided not to become an Episcopal priest. He is now a Roman Catholic. But with that baggage, if he accepts the Roman Catholic Church, he will now become a Roman Catholic priest down the road, theoretically speaking. He's married. So everyone wants this, people see it as a profession. Some of us in our culture, it's a way of life. We can't get away from our, that's elderhood. You can't get away from the spiritual aspects of your life.
Oh, yeah. So there's this danger then in the way people approach religion as sort of a set of principles, perhaps, or even beliefs or practices that are abstracted from personal identity or relationship, or the embodied nature of humans, or the fact that every human is situated someplace, and if you start thinking of religion as this sort of abstract thing that has nothing to do with that, then you can start thinking, well, then people can just get over all those attachments and just believe in this abstracted thing.
Correct.
That doesn't work.
Yeah, and for me, because of the relationship to my grandfather, relationship to tribalism, and my understanding of my indigenous construct, it's been the greatest liberation of my life. Because if I would have taken the Christianity model and the Episcopal model, the biblical model, I mean, I did this 40 years ago, and it was not a bad experience, but it has to integrate into your worldview, to your spiritual Christian worldview. And I have spiritual directors. I have people that I have to answer to. As my one spirit director said, Richard, you're dealing with people in their life. In Ojibwe tribalism, if I'm not careful with all people, I give the same values. And you and I have said this so many times. I mean, you can talk about this in a construct of words, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're words that fit. And I've done this so many times with people. Okay, you can talk about the 7 values: honesty, its relationship to yourself and other people; humility, you've got to have something to relate to people, like when I emotionally capped when somebody flooded on me. Truth, it's a perception. In the legal world I've been part of, it's a perception. I know this is a table, but it's hard. Wisdom, you gather wisdom, you mine wisdom. I'm pulling together in my 79 and a half years all the influences of my life as I speak this. It's based upon my discipline and my training as an indigenous Judeo-Christian. And then also, love and compassion, unconditional love. Like I shared with you, I provided transportation for somebody, and whether they thank me or not, thank you is okay. I got a friend that has ALS I'm going to visit tomorrow, and he's on his journey to die, but yet he accepts me as a person. And I didn't realize this. I bring him flowers because he can still smell. I mean, I didn't realize, and then I got a friend that has Parkinson's who exercises. And then respect. I respect creation, I respect all people, and then the last one is, which is the hardest one, is bravery and courage. Because the minute you say this, right away, people want to negate your expression, negate who you are. Is that really important? Did you do it this way? Like the translations we have here, I have a friend who does over citations. This is not new. This is just, I'm part of a journey that believes in the elder model, the elderhood. That's something you can't acquire. You can get a doctorate from Yale, a PhD from Harvard, or whatever. What you have to do in the Christian world, though, and I think this fits the book of Hebrews, is you have to be able to understand the culture you come out of, or the dynamic. But then there are times, and maybe I'm blessed not wanting to be the military warrior, not wanting to be the oppressor, not wanting to be the super competitor, not wanting to be the super exploiter, not wanting to use economics as a matter, but use relational understanding. And I believe the hurt of people in our society is trying to provide some holistic model for that to happen. And to me, as a Christian, and as an Episcopalian, as an indigenous person, it's interesting because everybody wants the answers, but it's an involving answer. But in the Hebrews, since it was a sermon or a letter, it was a format, you just present it. And I've been doing this church thing now for almost 40 years, so I've been through so many cycles. But then, as I share with you, one of my good friends says, the seasonality of time is different than the seasonality, I would say, God's time or our time. I mean, the industrial time, there's a different seasonality. And the way I get out of that, though, is everybody wants presentation. And I'm part of a tradition that's highly Anglo-Catholic. I'm really much more in the culture I'm from. When you're out in the woods or the field and you want to harvest wild rice, I don't deer hunt, but people offer, they make use of everything. And that's not to say it's not my place if people are finding their own way to the best of their ability. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to be...
Not your place in the sense that you're not going to interfere with their journey by manipulating them or telling them what to do, forcing them into something.
Yeah, but for this presentation, because I'm presenting a experiential model in their Master of Divinity program, and somebody says, well, some bishop said, is that really important? I says, well, it's important because this is life, living and breathing and understanding the principles that I live. Those are principles that could reflect anything. The Acts of the Apostles, the collective view of, if you think of Jesus' ministry as we move forward now, and the life. I didn't go into detail, which is not because it's biblical. It's more understanding there is a life, our Creator in the Ojibwe world too. There is this whole storyline. But as I mentioned to you many times, the only time, and I don't know, maybe I could be wrong, I could figure this out, but when those three wise guys came, or the three wise men, I mean, it's the cosmologies. I have a good friend who's an astronomer. He looked at that time period. He said there actually was a constellation in the dynamic. I remember I said before we started this, I says, some of the original tribal elders, our spiritual people, were just like the Einsteins, but they never expressed it in the Einstein mathematical model. Mm-hmm. Now that's I'm really out there, so I'll stop, because that's a model that says the first mapping of the world was the knowledge of the cosmos, and you never hear about that. The Lakota people have the star knowledge. Other Campbell's a series of the symbols of the world, if you want to call it that.
Well, it kind of relates to what you were saying earlier about the virtue of humility, right? You can't, somebody in an oral tradition, some of these things are passed down. I mean, you can't, I think it's simple intellectual humility to say that there was some really deep, interesting stuff going on in their thought, and just because it hasn't been written down in the way that people in the West write things down and footnote them, doesn't mean that those people didn't exist, or those cosmologies weren't, deep and thoughtful engagements with the world, not just sort of some, I don't know.
Yeah, and in this construct, the video will provide the terminology within like because I'm a former judge, like the transcript, the dynamics of citations in the new model of library science, the 20 citations I've used in a variety of this, it's allowing myself to visualize and to express myself without the hindrance of a so-called academic discipline. That's where experiential learning and portfolios of competencies, you're doing the same thing, but you're not carrying.
Yeah, documenting.
Well, you're documenting, but you don't need 25 copy editors to condense it. And it's just as important for that to take place. So for me, I have no problem, but I had to enter this Hebrews. Now, if I came from an authoritarian, oppressive tribe, I'd probably fall into the same dimension as the Judeo-Christians and the Jewish people at that time period. There are some tribes that would be very comfortable with that, but not me.
Could we return a second? Because I didn't quite understand what you were saying about bravery, about courage.
Okay.
It sounded like you were saying courage. Courage is manifest in having sort of the wherewithal to resist the encroachments on your personhood.
Correct. Yeah, and that's what we call personal sovereignty. And you've heard me do this many times.
Sticking up for yourself is
humbly,
courage.
but not exploitive, not dominating, not aggressive, not that whole mental DSM model of behavior. But courage and bravery is the ability to refrain from entering a world that the consequence would be harmful to both of you. Yeah. And then I believe the other one you asked, there was one other terminology, whatever, the 7 values of Ojibwe. I mean, this is pretty standard in cultures around the world. When I talk about respect, I have to respect the person, but I can't, I took a little bit, risk management is tough in this business. So I said, let's discuss this another time, because I just don't want to be, this is not, as a kid growing up, they used to have these TV programs, As the World Turns, the life is not a soap opera. Life is real. And to me, the compassion for weak, we also have to have compassion for the strong, because the strong become weak and the weak become strong. It's almost like a cyclic kind of dynamic. Like, I would not think of when these ordained priests or anyone gets sick, they're vulnerable. But I've noticed, my thesis is, nobody likes to deal with vulnerability. No one likes to deal with shortcomings. On the continuum now, these labelings like autistic or other things, let's just be nurturing to help people let's allow them to be healthy without labeling. And I think, to me, that's love and compassion. Like my friend who has ALS, I bring him flowers. I didn't realize you can, the last thing to go, I use is a smell. Now I have another friend who passed away who couldn't smell. So this person had to reconstruct how to eat food that wasn't contaminated, because the person could not smell.
Oh, wow.
And then the other one with truth, when I talk about truth, is the concept of truth depends upon the social contract you have with somebody. I mean, truth is a word that's kind of, biblically, this is, the biblical scholars say this is truth, but we take all this by faith. So you want truth to be guided by faith and grace, not guided by an evidentiary model that serves one purpose, not a purpose of. If there's an acceptance of this as clarity.
So it's maybe when you say something like evidentiary model, you mean something that is too simple. It's not holistic enough to encompass the dimensions that are important in reaching the truth.
Yeah, if I was doing this as a research project right now, or if a doctoral or a master's or something, I am a firm believer, as Bishop Charleston would say, or any theologian, the indigenous Judeo-Christian is the only way I can enter the realm. I cannot negate my indigenous paradigm. Mm-hmm. I understand the Judeo paradigm, and I understand the Christian. But if you ask me to negate one of those, then I might as well say I should become something else.
Well, yeah, and we've talked about this before. This idea of gift, like for example, the Tower of Babel story, or Act, Pentecost, or Acts 17, where it's pretty clear that from Paul's point of view, from the biblical point of view, the Creator cared for and provided for all these different cultures, and so to deny that is to deny a prior gift of the Creator. And how is that progress? If in order to receive one gift of Creator you have to deny another gift of Creator, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and to put it this way, some of the historic documents say the Ojibways were good at they knew how to portage, but by portage they went to other places, and they would come together in the springtime, like 1,000 or 2,000, to interact with one another. So that relationship of environment allowed for a stronger sense of community. So that would be a way to say the truth is a reflection of your culture, and that allows for an understanding of why I say, it just happened to me, this is by accident. I grew up in a tribal community. I did not live in the border town. I did not move to the city. I was not part of a residential school setting. I would walk by a Methodist church every day to go to the Roman Catholic mission. Then I went to a private liberal arts college where we had a diversity of religious classes in Western religion heritage. So I've always been balanced enough to appreciate. It was a time nobody questioned, no one bothered to question. That's something I always knew. And the only way I could enter this, it started this whole interview, our discussion on, I entered it through a indigenous portal.
Well, we've got an hour now. Is that a good place to?
That's a good place to stop.
Okay. Would you like to? I can cut what I'm saying now out. Yeah. But do you want to end? Do you want to give an ending speech, or is this good?
Let me just give a short ending speech. The consistency of the Old and New Testament and the understanding and making use of this model of communication allows me to pull together over 40 or 50 years of experiences that supports the experiential model. In this construct, I've had to read and remember and understand a whole series of translations. And it's not like I don't take this stuff seriously, but this is almost the result if I had to do a 200-page paper, that format. So I'm a firm believer with this new day and age, if you're equipped enough to do that, then you're equipped enough to balance out whatever truthful method you want, I'll provide. But given the fact that the seminary I'm involved in allows me to present this from an indigenous Judeo-Christian paradigm. If you don't allow me to do that, I'll become an academic and treat the indigenous Judeo-Christian similar to what a lot of indigenous theologians or people think about. That's why I'm such a believer in the Vine Deloria model and the Steve Charleston model and the indigenous model, because I have some difficulty with people who are academics who only take the Judeo-Christian and negate the indigenous. And we've had discussions on certain individuals who that represent. Notice how carefully we word that. I didn't say who they were, I didn't say what they're doing, but when they're unable to communicate in a traditional way, their indigenous background in community, border town, relocation, they have adapted similar understanding of the indigenous way through book knowledge. Book knowledge is important, but experiential knowledge is also important. And in a future video, as we get to some of the other courses, I will try to explain what I mean by mission and outreach in contrast to mutual ministry, because mission has been really a negative word to tribal communities. You know, the poor Native people, or it's a mission, the outreach, because if you negate the gifts of tribal people, you've negate their worth. So that is my summary at this point, but since we're going to be doing more of these, that fits the chronology of courses that I'm taking. So thank you, I appreciate this.